Warren, first of all, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
I'm delighted.
I thought maybe we could take a little time just to go back with the history of the annual meeting, because this is something that now has 40,000 people who are coming here to Omaha, but it started out as what?
Well, at the very first, we held the annual meeting in New Bedford, Mass. The company was a Massachusetts corporation, I believe, and so the first, after 1965, I'm not sure exactly how many, but roughly 5 or 6 meetings probably were held in New Bedford, and nobody came except the required officers. And then when we came to Omaha, we started having the meeting in the lunchroom at National Indemnity. And I would say for 7 or 8 years, or maybe 10, there'd be about a dozen people, counting my Uncle Fred and Aunt Katie and a few people who would come in. There would be about maybe 3 people from out of town, and I'd answer questions. And then in 1982 or thereabouts, whenever we merged with Blue Chip, we had a somewhat larger meeting. Microphones didn't work. Radio stations kind of kept cutting. But from that point forward, it just started growing.
What kind of questions did you get at the first meetings that were here at the National Indemnity in the lunchroom here?
Well, the only questions there'd be 2 or 3 people from out of town. They might ask a couple questions, but it was very short. Although I would stay as long as people wanted to answer their questions. But there were just a couple people there that would ask questions. My relatives never asked any questions.
When did that really start to change? After Blue Chip, it was bigger, but how many people are we talking?
Well, I think at that Blue Chip meeting, the first one that we had here when the microphones went bad, I think we probably had 100 people or something like that. And we were getting a whole new group of shareholders, for one thing, through the merger. And then we started meeting at the Jocelyn, then we met at the Orpheum, then we met at big motel chain thing. We went at Exarban, we went to Civic Center. We just kept enlarging the venues as time went along. And now I think we flattened out. Now that we webcast the meeting and everything, I think we'll probably stay fairly constant.
The questions that you've seemed to get at the shareholder meetings over the last decade or two are different than questions that you hear at just about any other publicly traded shareholder company or shareholder meeting. Yeah. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there is more of a family atmosphere to Berkshire than virtually any large corporation. I mean, people feel a connection, because we feel a connection to them. I mean, Charlie and I started managing money for other people, and they originally were just family and maybe a few friends. And so we've got a partnership feeling toward the people who have given us their money. And 70% of the shares of Berkshire were distributed from the partnership in 1969. And these are, they're my doctors, my neighbors, they're in the same zip code. I do very well trick-or-treating, they know me. So they come and we don't screen them, and they can ask whatever is on their mind. And sometimes they may get a few that are kind of silly, but the question is what's on their mind. And Charlie and I are there to talk with them, and we had so many getting kind of into personal questions that we've taken on this situation with the last, 6 or 8 or 10 years. We've had a combination of media and analysts to work in some maybe more substantive questions than some of the shareholders would want to ask, but we still want to hear from them. Now, there's a limit to how much you can do, but we're happy to spend 6 hours or so out there answering what's on their mind.
Any questions that have ever surprised you, or when did you first start getting some of these life lesson questions?
Yeah, the life ones, they probably started certainly in the 1980s. I mean, when we were at the Jocelyn, we were getting them at the Orpheum Theater, and Jocelyn only maybe held 800 people, and Orpheum a couple thousand. So we were getting them. A lot of the people were from Omaha that came too, and we never said anything was off limits. We wouldn't tell them what we were buying or selling, but they could talk about anything else, and it makes it more interesting. It's far more interesting than if you're just reading a bunch of numbers from the 10K or something of the sort.
Do you remember the first question that came up that had nothing to do with business?
Oh, we've had question do you follow this religion, getting into religion or getting into all kinds of things. And we had one young fellow that was 11 or 12, and he asked a question. He happened to be the grandson of a fellow from New York that had been with me in the partnership, and he asked a question one year, and I reported in the annual report that 11-year-old Nicholas asked me this question. The next year he stood up and he said, you know, when I asked that question, I was actually 10, and he said, if you can't even get that straight, why should I believe any of the other numbers? So we have fun at the meeting. We had a proposal at the meeting, and you know, it's designed to talk about what they want to talk about, and every now and then you get one that's kind of silly, but overwhelmingly, I think just the fact we're willing to talk about what they want to talk about is interesting. And I love being up there with Charlie because I never know what he's going to say. I find that the meeting's probably more interesting than any of the shareholders because I learn things from Charlie every time I talk to him.
You know, let's talk a little bit about, in the past, you're obviously an incredible investor, but when I've asked you in the past what you'd like to be remembered for, you've said you want to be remembered as a teacher.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, I've gotten so much from other teachers, and I enjoy it too. I mean, I have a good time talking with groups, usually students, but sometimes other groups too, and they appreciate it. I just had a group last Friday from 11 universities. We had Stanford, UCLA, we had Iowa, we had K-State, and we had Peking University. They came from China, and it is fun just talking to bright young people who have yet to live their lives, and they're much more interested in the personal stuff usually than investments. I mean, they're all going to do well financially, but some of them will make a lot of mistakes and other things, and maybe I can be of help. It's rewarding to you, and as long as they want to come, I'm willing to stand up there and talk to them.
How did the teaching of the students, how did the school's list get started?
I'm not exactly sure. I mean, some years ago, many years ago, when I would go to directors' meetings at Coca-Cola in Atlanta or Gillette in Boston, I would schedule a talk. And I mean, they'd ask me, but it'd be Harvard or Babson or Northeastern or whatever it might be, or it'd be Emory in Atlanta or Georgia Tech or whatever it might. And so they just ask, and I'd make a point of going a little bit earlier, staying a little late, and talking to them. And then that got to be a lot of work, and it became easier to have them come here. So I now take them in. Now I take them in groups of 10 schools, 20 students per group. At least a third of them have to be women, and then they can ask anything they want.
Why do a third of them have to be women?
Because the guys were crowding out the women before that, and one way or another they seem to control the apparatus within their business school or whatever. And so I just told them, you know, if you don't bring a third woman, you don't get invited back again.
What type of questions do the students ask?
They ask everything. They ask, you know, whether it's marriage or you know, whether it's something. I mean, a lot of the questions are investment oriented, but a lot of them are just how they should lead their lives, and they listen. You know, I mean, if I talk to some trade association, a bunch of 60-year-olds, they basically they want to be entertained and they want tips, but they're not going to change anything, you know, in their lives. But these young people do, and I hear from them afterwards. I hear from a lot of them afterwards.
What do they say? Well,
they usually start out by saying thanks, but then they get specific sometimes, and other times it's very short, but sometimes it's quite long. Sometimes they ask for a job.
Is there a point, I mean, when you started doing this in your business, when you started investing, you were doing it out of your home.
Exactly, 6 years.
Kind of toiling away.
Nobody, no employees. And I made the mistake of starting additional partnerships rather than putting everybody in one. So I grew to the place where I had 11 different partnerships. So every time I bought a block of stock, I had to break it into 11 tickets. I had to write 11 checks because I wrote the checks myself. This is when you took physical delivery of securities. I'd go down to the Omaha National Bank and actually receive the securities, put them in safe deposit boxes. I picked up the mail every morning. I went down to the 38th Street and picked up the mail. I mean, I wrote away for the annual reports myself. Had a little IBM typewriter, and so it was a very peculiar. It was this little room off my bedroom, so I just go down occasionally to get what in those days I have to admit was a Pepsi, but and potato chips, and go back up to work.
But to your neighbors, it looked like you weren't doing much of anything, right?
That's true. I had this one neighbor, Don Keogh, who went on to be president of Coca-Cola Company, and his oldest daughter used to come over because we had a jungle gym in the backyard. So we'd play on the swings as he went off to sell coffee. And when it came time to ask him about joining my partnership, he said, if you think I'm going to give $5,000, the guy who spends all day riding on the slides with Kathy, he says, you're out of your mind.
So how do you go from being the guy who works up in the attic and kind of squirrels around the house all day to the guy who can't walk down the street without people recognizing you, recognizing your voice, and asking for tips on how to live life?
It's not that much different. I mean, it could be maybe a pain under some circumstances, but it really isn't. I mean, people in Omaha, the cleaning lady calls me Warren. I mean, my relationship to them really hasn't changed very much. And I do get recognized more out of town than I used to. My friend Carol Loomis used to say I should be a private investigator because I'm so forgettable. I could be following somebody for 10 years, they never notice. But maybe it's the white hair or something. But now there's more of that. But it's fine, you know. It's it hasn't really changed my life that much.
Was there a point though where you realized, okay, this is different? Because I've seen you walk down the street in New York City and had people who are turning around trying to take selfies of you as you're walking down the street.
Yeah, thanks to being on television. I'm recognized more, and probably the older you get, the more kind of distinctive you look from other people. But it's helped my life more than it's hurt my life. I mean, I think people, well, who knows what their lives may be, but it hasn't hurt mine at all.
I think about it though. You're somebody who never felt very comfortable speaking publicly. In fact,
I was terrified.
Yeah.
When I was young, I couldn't do it. I mean, I took the Dale Carnegie course and handed the guy, after once signing up and stopping payment on the check of $100, the second time with Wally Keenan in Omaha, I gave him $100 in cash. And instantly we became good friends. He joined the partnership and did very well. But it forced me and 30 others in the class to get up and, if necessary, make fools of ourselves, but somehow avoid getting tangled up, you know, just in all the mental blocks that come with me in public speaking. And I went right out after I'd finished that and went to what was then the University of Omaha. And I just said, I want to teach because I got to get up in front of people.
And that first class that you were teaching was what?
It was investments, but I had these students, a good many of them came from Strategic Air Command. They were in programs. So they were twice my age, and they were majors or maybe colonels even. And at the end of one of my first ones, this 40-year-old major came up and he said, after 2 hours, I think I'm dazzling him and everything, and he comes up, what was that all about? I said, that was the Socratic method. I said, that's the way I teach. And the guy looked at me and he said, well, pal, he says, I got to tell you something. You ain't Socrates. You
have a lot more people who are willing to listen to you these days, though.
Well, that is true. But, yeah, wasn't the very first class, but I would have my Aunt Alice in there. And I had a good many people who later joined my partnership, but that was 5 or 6 years. Well, it's more than that even later. But these were Omahans. They were friends. Some were young, some were old.
Why do you think that people are so eager to get advice from you and Charlie?
Well, we've been around a long time, so we're known, and we do have a decent record over time, and we're giving the same advice. I mean, we're giving the advice I got in terms of life from my dad, in terms of investments from Ben Graham. I mean, we're passing on what we learned from somebody else, and it does work. And what we're saying makes sense. Doesn't mean there aren't other ways of doing things, but it will work what we're talking about, and they know we like them. You know, I mean, Charlie and I like to talk, and we enjoy interaction. And we like getting challenged on ideas as well.
You went to school at Columbia University for the business program.
That's right.
You went to work for Ben Graham and were working in New York City at that time.
Well, there was a gap of 3 years because he wouldn't hire me when I volunteered. And so I came out to Omaha. I was only 20 years old then, so I started selling stocks. And although I was 20, I looked about 16 and I behaved like I was about 12. I was not a huge success at selling securities. And actually I took the Dale Carnegie course about that time to make it easier. But there was some guy I was going to call on, and I'd get over to his tailor shop or whatever it might be, and I'd walk around the block about 4 times delaying before I went in.
You did go to work for Ben Graham in New York City, and then you came back. Why'd you leave New York when everybody thinks Wall Street is where you should be if you're going to be in business like that? Why Omaha?
I just felt it'd be a better life. I had 2 children at that point, and my wife never said a word against moving there, but her life was more in Omaha too. Her parents were here, my parents were here, my aunts and uncles were here. I mean, it was her best friends from high school were here. It was a better place to live, and it was a better place in my view to raise a family. And I had a lot of friends in Wall Street. It was a good thing I worked there, but I did not want to keep going. I lived in White Plains, and I took the train in, and I went to the train, and there wasn't much life outside what would happen between those train trips on each side. It's just been a better life.
Do you think it's been easier to insulate yourself from some of the more questionable business practices?
Yeah, and the nuttiness generally of that. When I was in New York, there was no way that I was sitting at this little office at 42nd and Lexington Avenue, Graham Newman, and I was getting a certain number of the calls, not that many calls, but from brokers. And they were all throwing out ideas and hoping to get business from the little firm I worked for. And so there was an overstimulation factor. There was a tendency to want to do too many things. If I do 10 or 15 good things in investments in my life, I'm going to do very, very well. You do not need hundreds and hundreds of ideas, and most ideas aren't any good. But it's a business where emotions play a big part with most people, and emotions do not help you make good decisions in investing. So Omaha's been a much better place for me.
I wonder if that's part of the reason that people are attracted to your advice, because it is a step removed from the latest craze or the latest fad or chasing down things.
Yeah, and I'm not selling them anything either. And so it's unbiased advice from somebody who's been around a long time. It's worked in my case for me and worked for Charlie, and I try to talk their language. Basically, it's my own language, so it's not an effort. But I think that helps. I think people can tell when you're saying what you believe versus talking points. It always infuriates me when every time somebody thinks I might talk about politics or this or that, they want to give you talking points. If I feel like going on there with the talking points, just reading them and saying who said it to me. It's kind of irritating. But anyway, I enjoy it.
In that vein, you write your own annual shareholder letter every year.
I write the letter. It's edited by a good friend of mine, Carol Loomis, but the letter's mine.
It's been 53 years. The very first letter that you wrote, how did that go? Did it go straight to the shareholders?
No, the very first, I felt the necessity then. Berkshire Hathaway was controlled by Buffett Partnership. We had control of the company, control of the board. But they had a couple thousand shareholders, and they had reported in a certain form over the years. And we controlled it, but I did not take official positions where they didn't draw a salary from Berkshire or anything. I did write the report, but initially I kind of wrote it in the same mode as previously had been reported. And then their custom was to send it to the company lawyer at Ropes and Gray, a fellow named Ernie Sarge, a wonderful fellow. And he sent it back with a whole lot of thoughts about what I should or shouldn't say. So from that point on, I never cited the lawyers again.
The unvarnished truth.
I'm not saying anything in there that I don't believe is true, so I do it in my own way. Although it shifted to my own way gradually over time. But particularly after I dissolved the partnership in 1970. Then I took a position as chairman of the board, and I got more serious about writing the report. And then I was on an SEC committee in 1977 on disclosure, and I think I really decided to step up the writing as if I was writing to my sisters, because I actually participated in a little book that the SEC wrote about plain writing, and it is a technique I use. I write Dear Bertie and Doris, and then I later changed it to Dear Shareholders. But it helps to have somebody in mind that you're talking to, and my sisters are both very bright. They've got practically all their money in Berkshire, so they're interested, but they're not following day to day what's going on. And so I try to use a vocabulary and talk in a manner that I would talk if I was sitting talking to them.
That style has attracted a huge following, and I know you hear from a lot of people too. What kind of mail, letters, cards, phone calls do you get at the office?
Yeah, I don't get that many phone calls, but I get quite a few letters, and I've gotten way more letters as the years have gone by. But that's partly because books have been written, or because I'm on CNBC or something of the sort, and a lot of them they're just very nice letters. I mean, they come frequently handwritten, and they're not emails, but sometimes they are. But they're just letters, and I'm glad people feel they can write me. Now, some of them just want an autograph or a picture or something like that, but we don't count those. But some of them just say that they appreciate getting advice, and a lot of actually a fair number say they were doing it wrong before, and those are the nice ones to get.
Do you respond to those letters? Do you read them?
I read them. Yeah, I definitely read them, and I sometimes respond fairly often on the letter itself. It's just I don't want to take up my assistant's time dictating letters and everything. She's got more than enough to do, so frequently I'll scribble a line or two on it and send it back. Sometimes I got a little note paper and I send it, and other times I don't. I mean, it just depends on how much is going on to some extent.
Do you think there's a danger of becoming mythologized, of any of this being twisted or being out of your control?
Well, there certainly is, in the sense that people sometimes use my name on internet stuff to promote things, and I mean, and you really can't stop much of that. So you get people trying to commercialize, and frequently outside the United States, where they're really just using it to try and entice people to something that they're going to get a bad result in. So I don't like that, and it's very hard to police that sort of thing. And you certainly don't want people to get their expectations up about getting returns that are similar with the huge amounts of money we manage now compared to what we could do 50 years ago. My returns have gone down every decade of my life since the 1950s. I did my best in the 50s. I did second best in it's just taken down the line, and it's from working with more money, and it's probably from having more competition.
Yeah. Was there a point where you ever looked back and thought, wow, this was a moment that I realized it's no longer just about me and this small group of my family and friends and partners? Was there a moment that ever struck you?
I think it just sort of crept along as the crowds at the meeting increased, and the requests for the annual reports. We get a lot of requests for the reports, and it's been sort of writing a book on the installment system with a lot of repetition, but it's been sort of gradual as it went along. I mean, if some book came out, well, there was the first book, Robert Hanks, not necessarily the first book, but the one that hit big was one by a fellow named Robert Hagstrom, who I really didn't know, but he sold a lot of copies back around 1993 or thereabouts, and then it's become a little small industry of people. They can always sell 10 or 15,000 copies. They write nothing but repeat something that's been said earlier. So, but I would say a few books have stimulated things. I'd say a few TV things have stimulated things. It's sort of cumulative.
Warren, thank you so much
Thank
for your
you.
time.
Okay.
I really appreciate it.